Okay, thank you, Wally. And we move now to the keynotes, and we're going to start with Mele Wendt. I did this interview, I recorded this interview back in late November. So Mele is not here, but she, is very much here and through the video. And let me just give an introduction and talk a little bit about Mele and who she is and what she's done. Basically, she's been in education for 24 years, first as a secondary school teacher, and then at Victoria University as the founding Pacific Liaison Officer and the manager of Domestic Student Recruitment and Course Advice Office. Mele then served 10 years as the executive director of Fulbright New Zealand, where I met her as a Fulbright scholar in 2005. And over the past 5 years, she's been acting doing governance and consultancies in various areas, including scholarships, Pacific Peoples Development, governance, and organizational capacity building. Her governance career spans over 20 years across 15 different entities. She's a member of Pacifica, the Institute of Directors, Wellington Pacifica Business Network, and Super Diverse Women. She's also a white ribbon ambassador advocating against violence towards women. Mele is Samoan and grew up in Samoa and Fiji. She's married with 4 children and 3 grandchildren and has lived in Wellington for about 30 years. In January 2019, Mele was awarded a member of the New Zealand Order of Merit for her services to governance, Pacific community, and women. And with that, let's play the video. Hello, Mele. Thank you so much for being willing to participate in this and the launching of the global school, and in particular, our little portion of Oceania. And so some of the questions, I sent you some of the questions, but let me read the first one. When you think of this region of the world called Oceania, what comes to mind for you? How would you describe it? And what do you find most interesting about it?
Yeah, so for me, Oceania centers on the Pacific region, and I think of this expansive area between Southeast Asia and the 2 Americas. So from Hawaii in the north to Micronesia and Papua New Guinea in the northwest, to Australia in the west, and Aotearoa, New Zealand in the south, and of course Rapa Nui, Easter Island, all the way in the east there, and everything in between, which according to Google has over 20,000 islands. But I describe it really for me as one of the most amazing places on earth.
Why is that?
But pardon?
Why is that? I'm curious. What?
Well, I just think because I grew up in it, and because of its complexities and diversity and richness and just all the positive things about it. But for me, it's really because it's home. It's where I was born. It's where I live, and it's where I'll die. And I choose. There's no other place on earth that I'd rather live. Obviously, I'd like to. We travel to other parts of the world, but really for me, it's my whenua, my tūranga waiwai, as Māori would call it, my true home. But I also think of the region as extremely amazing, 7 million people in the Pacific, 5 million people in New Zealand, and 25 million people in Australia, but a couple of thousand different languages. In Papua New Guinea alone, there's 800 different languages, unique languages. Diverse geographies, flora and fauna. We have so many unique and endemic species in our region. In terms of size, we have the huge continent Australia, but we also have the smallest country in the world, Nauru. We have westernized, developed countries like in Australia and New Zealand, but you also have really small, developing island states, some of which are really deemed, poor, very poor, according to world rankings. But of course, it's the beauty of the region, warm and sunny and white sandy beaches, sparkling blue water, surf, amazing landscapes, etc. And also, if you think about the peopling of the Pacific, it's an amazing migration story of journeying of Pacific people. Well, we weren't Pacific people then, but of people coming down from Southeast Asia through Papua New Guinea, settling in Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga, and then moving out to Rapa Nui, to Hawaii, and then lastly to Aotearoa, and using navigation and a whole lot of knowledges to do that. I mean, it was an amazing feat. So obviously, as you can tell, I'm quite passionate about it, and I'm really proud of the region that I live in, and of Oceania.
Thank you. That's great. So how do you think growing up in both Fiji and Samoa has shaped the way that you, and then living in New Zealand since your university days, has shaped the way you think about Oceania as a region?
Well, it's definitely shaped how I think about Oceania. I mean, it's very much within me, and how I see Oceania. But I just want to highlight that I actually was not, it was the term Oceania wasn't used when I was growing up in Samoa and Fiji. At school, we learned the term was South Pacific, or the Pacific Ocean, or Pacific Islands, and Oceania was definitely not used in everyday language, and in the education system. And it's certainly even now New Zealand, there's Oceania is not used either. I only really heard about Oceania when my father, Albert Wendt, used, he would use it in conversation occasionally. But in 1976, he wrote an essay called Towards a New Oceania, which summarized the eras of the colonial past in the Pacific and questioned notions of tradition and authenticity, and looked forward to the future of the Pacific. And I thought it might be a good idea to read the opening paragraph in this essay, because I can almost feel like these are sentiments that I would express to you in terms of how I feel about the region. Yeah. So this is the opening paragraph for this published essay that he wrote in 1976. I belong to Oceania, or at least I am rooted in a fertile portion of it, and it nourishes my spirit, helps to define me, and feeds my imagination. A detached, objective analysis I will leave to the sociologist and all the other ologists who have plagued Oceania since she captured the imagination of the Pālangi in his quest for El Dorado, a southern continent, and the noble savage in a tropical Eden. So vast, so fabulously varied, a scatter of islands, nations, cultures, mythologies, and myths, so dazzling a creature, Oceania deserves more than an attempt at mundane fact. Only the imagination in free flight can hope, if not to contain her, to grasp some of her shape, plumage, and pain. I will not pretend that I know her in all her manifestations. No one, not even our gods, ever did. No one does, bracket, UNESCO experts and consultants included, close bracket. No one ever will, because whenever we think we have captured her, she has already assumed new guises. The love affair is endless. Even her vital statistics, as it were, will change endlessly. And he goes on to talk about that. So,
wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, but I think I've been able, sorry?
1976, wow.
Yes, so it is held up as sort of one of the seminal sort of landmark essays, first written by an Oceanian about ourselves. But other people have gone on to write about our own region, from within. But I've definitely been able to foster a deep love for Oceania and enjoy it and appreciate it in all its glory and richness, whilst at the same time being able to learn and understand its complexities and flaws and challenges.
Well, that leads perfectly to the next question. So what, what do you think some of the opportunities and challenges are for the region?
Well, actually, this is sort of the most depressing part of this interview, and in my little research that I did in preparation for this interview, because when I think about it, and when you read about, and when you Google what are the key challenges in the Pacific, there are just pages upon pages and pages of papers and websites, and there's so much information out there about all the problems and the issues and challenges faced in the Pacific region. It's really quite depressing. But anyway, I will talk about them, and I'll talk about challenges first, and I've sort of grouped them in sort of key areas. So starting with the environmental and ecological challenges, islands' small scale and ecological sensitivity mean that the environments are extremely, fragile, some of the most fragile environments in the world. But climate change definitely tops the list of the big issues across all, the whole of Oceania and the world, obviously. But our region has high exposure to natural disasters. We've got rising sea levels, there's coastal erosion, deforestation, soil salination, and of course, because of the large oceans resources, we have whaling, we have overfishing, we have huge litter problems, non-biodegradable waste and toxic chemicals and industrial pollution. We also have a range of endangered species in our region. Economically, we have huge, because of our small size, our small populations, and our isolation, and our high exposure to natural disasters. Our countries are uniquely vulnerable to economic shocks. We depend on global commodity markets for a large part of basic needs and incomes, which leaves households vulnerable to large swings in prices for things like food and fuel. There is hardship. I mean, I wouldn't say there was large amounts of poverty. I think people in the Pacific would say, no, there's no poverty here. But there's definitely hardship. There are definite inequalities in many of our countries, and there are large gaps between the rich and the poor. And in many countries, those gaps are growing. Our region has hugely youthful populations, and many of those young people don't have adequate access to education, and there aren't enough jobs. And so in some places there are high levels of unemployment. And of course, COVID has decimated many island economies, which of course relied on tourism. And, this morning I read in the news that in Aotearoa, domestic tourism is booming as Kiwis get out and explore the country. But without international tourists, New Zealand will face a deficit of nearly 13 billion. So that's the impact that it's going to have and having on New Zealand's economy. Imagine what the impact will be on our Pacific Island states. In terms of people's health, we are in some parts of the Pacific, there are high child mortality rates, maternal health issues, because of our poor Western diets and sedentary lifestyles, which have changed from traditional lifestyles involving a lot of physical work. High rates of obesity, some of the highest in the world, very high rates of non-communicable diseases, like cardiovascular diseases, heart attack, stroke, cancer rates are high, respiratory diseases, and of course diabetes, and we have the highest rates in the world. And in some parts of the Pacific, malaria, HIV, AIDS, and other diseases are there. And of course, now there's COVID. COVID has impacted French Polynesia. Thankfully, it hasn't impacted on some of our smaller island states, and they're doing everything that they can to prevent it from arriving. But of course, that will depend on how the rest of the world deals with COVID. And we know in many parts of the world, they're dealing very badly with COVID. And I shall not name any countries in particular.
Let me guess, no.
Right, yeah. But in terms of social challenges and development challenges, there's a lot of corruption in a lot of our countries. There's poor governance. There's conflict, intercommunal violence, and our domestic violence rates throughout a lot of our Pacific countries and in New Zealand and even Australia are extremely high.
Mm.
I mentioned education. You know, not everybody is able to get a universal primary education in our region. We also have gender inequality and lack of women's empowerment.
Mm.
There are border security issues. And culturally, there's language loss. There's loss of cultural knowledges, traditions, and practices. You know, every day, these things are being lost. So that gives you a really, for me anyway, you know, it's actually really quite depressing when I think about it. But on the flip side, you know, in terms of the opportunities and the successes, I mean, we are world leading and highly sought after in several areas, like in music and dance and sports. You know, we have the best sports team in the world, the All Blacks, here in Aotearoa. We have people who are, you know, opening for major, you know, US stars, you know, singers and things like that. We've got an amazing creative arts environment throughout the Pacific. You know, Indigenous arts are being shared across not only Oceania, but across the world at festivals and conferences. And there's a considerable body of literature now from our region. And you know, there are huge resources in the Pacific. You know, if you think about the minerals in Papua New Guinea and Papua, and the oceans as an important economic resource. But what else? You know, we have a lot of, you know, people doing it in the Pacific for themselves, who are getting on with it, who are creating social enterprise and community-based approaches to enabling themselves to make a living and, you know, to live, I suppose. But we also have some cooperation between governments and international, you know, development partners and regional organizations that are sort of working cooperatively. And there are some regional initiatives that are showing some level of success. So, you know, we can only build on those. But I think one of the biggest opportunities is around Indigenous knowledges. That, you know, not only in addressing challenges in Oceania, but in addressing global challenges. So, for example, I've got quite a few examples. You know, there's recent talk that amongst ocean scientists that Indigenous Pacific knowledge can inform the science to save the world's oceans. That in our knowledges in agriculture and for weather and seasonal climate forecasting and making farming relating decisions can really reduce vulnerability to environmental hazards. Our Indigenous knowledges in fields as astronomy, physics, conservation biology, aquaculture, marine management, resource management, medicines and health sciences, for example, incorporating Indigenous knowledge in diabetes research. I read online that that's, you know, has potential to really help. But you just want to reinforce that, you know, Indigenous peoples in Oceania aren't waiting to be saved, and, you know, they're going to continue using those knowledges to share those knowledges to really help get them out of the problems that they're in. But I think, you know, on the real positive, there's something really powerful shifting here in the region around, you know, calling it an Indigenous Moana energy force that is building critical mass and momentum. And that's, you know, about drawing on Indigenous resources in our leadership and in various aspects of society to really sustain ourselves.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that?
Yeah.
So the sort of the nexus or the hub between traditional Western science and Indigenous knowledge, do you see that is that people are talking to each other and are genuinely open to each other and in moving forward with both sets of knowledge? Is that something you see?
We're not there yet. but we're at the start of that. So from what I've heard and see, there is now, Western medicine is now starting to wise up to the fact that actually the solutions to a lot of our health problems will come and do come from Indigenous knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
But we're not there yet. I mean, you still get that whole, snobbish, elitist kind of Western science sort of,
right,
snobbishness that really gets in the way of going, well, actually, maybe if we did look at, the people of Papua New Guinea have been treating this illness with this particular plant, maybe this, and that's been going on in medicine for a long time, but it's really acknowledging the Indigenous knowledge. That's really the issue, I think. Let's empower, let's partner with, and let's share the benefits.
Right.
See, there's been a exploitation of that, and the benefits and the resources that are generated as a result of producing these medicines and selling them to the world. Those benefits aren't going to the people whose knowledge they got them that knowledge from.
Right. Well, thank you. So let me ask you this. We're going to the next question here. And this speaks to the question of power, the balance of power in Oceania, where I think of Australia, New Zealand as the two heavyweights, and I listed New Caledonia, although I don't know a lot about New Caledonia. And so how does that play out in the politics across the region, in the economic activity? What are the challenges that poses from your perspective?
Yeah, well, in my view, it's hugely imbalanced. Everything, all those things are imbalanced. The larger and more resourceful countries do have more power, and they have greater success, and they have greater economies, more resilient economies, etc. But as I mentioned earlier, it is good that, in certain systems like the United Nations systems and the Pacific Forum contexts, every country has one vote. So when it comes to global or regional decision-making and governance, it doesn't matter that, the country of Nauru has the same power in a vote as New Zealand does or Australia does. So I think that sort of helps. Mm-hmm. And some countries in the region are doing relatively well despite their small size. For example, Samoa, economically and in many ways, Samoa's actually over the last 20 years has been going really quite well when you compare it to other Pacific countries. Yeah. But we do have the longest serving prime minister in the Pacific, and there's no opposition, and the government dictates and railroads things through, and some of those things are good and some of them are bad. So he's a bit of an autocrat, but overall there are some pockets where, despite their size and their lack of resources, they're managing okay, whilst others are not. Mm-hmm. But I definitely think, the bigger and more resources you have, definitely the more weight you can pull, the more power you have.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, and then final question. Let's see. Yeah, final question. Do you think that the term Oceania rather makes sense, or is a useful or good label for the region? Thinking back to your father's essay, I mean, it's a beautiful term. I'm just wondering, do you think it's the right term, or do you think, is there another term or a better term, or what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, well, I do think that there is merit in having a term, a label to identify the region, and that a term that highlights its uniqueness and in a unifying way. I guess I'm okay with the term Oceania, but noting before what I mentioned before, that it's not widely used in the region. I think it's more a term that's used by the rest of the world for this region. So it's not, as I said, it's not every day. It's not used every day, and I think even people's understanding of Oceania and who, what countries are in Oceania. I think people wouldn't even necessarily know about that. But anyway, I'm okay with the term. And of course, that's acknowledging that the term and other terms like the South Pacific, the Pacific Ocean, Polynesian, Micronesian, Melanesia are all Western constructs in the English language imposed on us by colonizers. And if I think about, Samoa, where I'm from, in Samoa, there is no term for this region, for the Pacific or Oceania. The Samoan words for ocean are vasa and moana. And Samoa now has a transliteration term for the Pacific Ocean, which is Le Vasa Pacifica, Le Va Vasa Ocean, and Pacifica, transliteration of Pacific. Yes, I think there could be a different label that makes more sense to people in the region. And there's a growing movement or an initiative to call the region Moana. And last year, a conference was held in Auckland on this very topic. And the general consensus was that we should use Moana in place of Oceania. And the reason for that, they said, was that it identifies all Pacifica peoples, their lands, their waters, and their cultures. And I thought I would read out Tevita Kaili, an associate professor in international cultural studies and cultural anthropology at BYU in Hawaii, and he's of Tongan descent, wrote in 2017. As part of the decolonization within the Pacific, there is a reclaiming of the indigenous name Moana. I use the name Moana instead of Polynesia or Pacific because Moana is an indigenous name for the Pacific Ocean in many of the islands. I also use the term Moana to highlight the oceanic culture of people from the islands. And he goes on to talk about how he was inspired by various people's writings, but also the fact that in Tonga, the name Samoana means sea people, and the name Api Moana means ocean homeland. And of course, here in the Pacific Ocean, here in Aotearoa, Maori use Te Moana Nui a Kiwa, referring to the Pacific. And in Hawaii, the Hawaiian word for this region is Moana, the Pacific Ocean is Moana a Kea. And so then he talks about, the term Moana appears to originate from the worldview of in-between space. In fact, the word moa, na, may be derived from the word moa, which means middle space or in-between space. Thus, Moana is the space between islands. Anyway, so there's a growing movement to use the term Moana for Oceania and the Pacific region, but not everyone agrees. There have been some people who have spoken out, especially from Melanesia, who can't relate to Moana because it's not a word that's a part of their language or references. And so I don't think you'll ever get consensus around. We're not going to get agreement from everybody in the region of a particular term. And meanwhile, though, I think people like Tevita and other scholars will use the term Moana more and more. But for me, it doesn't matter really what we call the oceanic region. It's what we do about it, with it, to not only sustain it, but to thrive in it.
Well, thank you so much, Mele. This has been very interesting, and I think it will provide viewers with a really good foundation understanding of the region and of the challenges and the opportunities and the controversies that exist there. Thank you for your time on this lovely Tuesday morning for you. It looks like nice blue sky out there. I'm looking at it's a nice day. It's a
beautiful, beautiful Wellington day. You can't beat Wellington on a good day.
No, you cannot. I know that for a fact.